So yeah, if you're just joining, my name is Tom Tate. I think when I had to send a short bio, I just said I'm an average guy living outside of Philadelphia with my wife and three kids, pictured here. I'm a marketer by trade. So typically I do give a lot of talks, but they're typically marketing talks, right? So I'll talk about email marketing, email automation, social media marketing. Right now, product marketing is kind of my area of focus. So I don't typically give talks like this. I give very specific talks like how to do Facebook ad campaigns and how to create automated email sequences. This one is a bit different for me, but we're living through different times. So different times call for different talks. So I put this together back in March, and I haven't made many changes. So we might actually see as I go through this, I might stumble through a few things that seem out of place because so much has changed since March, the end of March, and now, mid May at the time of this recording. But I gave this talk at a virtual podcast conference. Mike saw it, and Mike reached out to me and said it would be great for the group. I hope that is the case. So I hope that you enjoy this. The original talk was embracing your audio advantage in times of uncertainty. Still applies for sure. I tweaked it slightly to podcasting through a pandemic because that's where we're at, and that's where we may be for the indefinite future, right? So a couple of assumptions before I really get into it. I'm assuming that you have a podcast if you're a part of this group or this association. If not, I will assume that you want to have a podcast. And even if you don't have a podcast or want to have a podcast, I'm just going to assume that you know what a podcast is, right? Hopefully that's the case. So back in January, it was January 22nd, I follow a newsletter, Next Draft by Dave Pell. It's one of my favorite newsletters. It's almost daily. It's a great source for the news. And he sent this out. It was number 4. It wasn't even like the top spot, but it was going viral. And it talks about a newly identified strain of coronavirus that has killed only 17 people. At this time, it was only 17 in China. And I kind of perked up when I read this. The number wasn't staggering enough to get me concerned, right? But this was actually the first time that I heard about what we now know as SARS-CoV-2 and coronavirus. That was only 118 days ago, which feels like a lifetime. And at the time that I originally did this, it was only 66 days ago when I originally did this talk. And I feel like every week, for us at least, here in outside of Philly, for every week that goes by, it almost feels like a month. It's been really the time just feels very different now. And I think a lot of it has to do with this uncertainty. And this is a word that's been thrown around a lot over the past couple of months. Uncertainty, we hear about that a lot. And I think that it's an appropriate word to describe the climate that we're living through right now. And when you're living through this uncertainty, I think what comes with it is pain and discomfort of just not knowing, right? To me, that's the biggest challenge is the not knowing piece, right? And the thing that kind of keeps me up at night is not knowing. When you go out to the supermarket, you don't know what you're being exposed to. When you wake up with the sore throat, you don't know if it's allergies or something else. And there's just a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what the economy is going to do. We don't know if our jobs are as secure as we hope they are. So there's discomfort there. There's pain. And I acknowledged this back in March. And I honestly think it's only amplified since then. Since then I've taken a pay cut. We've let people go. Other organizations have let a lot of people go. So totally acknowledging this. It's probably the biggest challenge. But the challenge that I've been putting on myself, and I've been trying to encourage this with others, is as podcasters. Well, more than just as podcasters, as people, right? If you look at your local governments, if you look at your local schools, businesses, you're starting to see who the real leaders are. And I'm not going to get political with this at all. I'm not going to point it and fingers at anybody. But there's no playbook. There was no playbook for this pandemic. There might have been pandemic playbooks, generic playbooks, but there really was no major playbook that was ready, that prepared people for this. So you're starting to see who does really well, who thrives, and who's able to lead when there is pain and no playbook. And I think that as people, the challenge is on us, to lead, to step up and lead. For me, as a father, as a husband, in my job, but also like as you keep going down different layers, as a podcaster, right? And I think that right now we need leaders more than anything else, at all different levels, not just nationally, not just globally, but at all levels. And I think that we're being called to lead through the pain. And this talk is really, it's centered on this, right? It's centered on this idea that as podcasters, we have a voice, we have a platform, we have the ability to push content out through that platform, and hopefully we have an audience, right? And if we don't have an audience, we're working on building that audience, right? And if you have an audience, you have the opportunity to lead. And if you have a voice, you have the opportunity to lead. And I think that now more than ever, we need leaders. And if you're a podcaster, we need you. We need you to lead. And that doesn't mean that you have to create a political podcast or you have to create a coronavirus podcast, as I'm going to talk through over the next couple of slides. There's a lot that you can be doing. And the purpose of this talk really is just to frame that, so that we're really leveraging our influence, our audio influence, to our advantage. So I'm going to talk through 3 quick ways that you can lead with audio, specifically audio as the format, ways that you can lead your audience, ways that you can lead yourself, and ways that you can lead specifically with tangible value. So the first thing that I will mention is that whether you believe this or not, your audience really needs you now, probably now more than ever. I know that when COVID hit and businesses started to shut down, a lot of statistics came out that podcast consumption was going down because people were no longer traveling, there were no longer commuting, so that people were spending less time within their daily routine where podcasting had its place, podcast consumption had its place. And I haven't really doubled back on that to check to see if that's still decreasing or if it flatlined or if it went back to normal. I haven't really checked back on that. But regardless of the numbers, regardless of download numbers and consumption stats, right? Your listeners are most likely at home right now. I know states across the United States are starting to reopen in different phases. But for the most part, you hear big companies are still asking, if you can work from home, they want you to continue to work from home. And they're dealing with a lot of things. They're dealing with kids at home, working remotely for the first time, lack of connection, personal connection, human connection. These are all real things that people are dealing with. Unemployment, pay cuts, and uncertainty. And I'll wish everybody who's watching this or watching the replay just a ton of health and safety. But there are people who are dealing with health, not just COVID-19, but there are people who are dealing with everyday health issues, and they're now not getting the normal care that they usually get. People are dealing with mental health issues. Your audience needs you. People are going through a lot right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. And if ever there was a time for you to consistently put out content that once resonated with your audience, now is the time to continue to do that. So the first thing that I think everyone should be focused on during the pandemic as podcasters is to stay consistent, so that if you are physically able to create your episodes and put them out on your feed, if you do an hour podcast and you find that you just don't have the time to do an hour podcast, still do a 15 or 20-minute podcast. Just keep that feed active, because the number one way to lead your audience through these choppy waters is to stay consistent and put out your content. I think that releasing your regularly scheduled programming is really important because everybody has these anchors. I found that with talking to podcast listeners, a lot of people have these anchors within their life, so that every Tuesday morning driving to work, they listen to this specific podcast, or every Saturday when they're mowing the lawn, they listen to this specific podcast. And believe it or not, that podcast is there for them, during those times. And there are going to be times when they will look for those anchors to feel any type of normalcy. And if your podcast was one of those anchors, it's really valuable, right? To make sure that it's there, make sure that you are staying consistent and staying active in that person's life. In other words, your podcast has the potential to be comfort food. That thing that makes them feel warm inside when they're not feeling well. So I have a picture of soup here, which of course is kind of the go-to comfort food when you're not feeling well. There's a lot of people that aren't feeling well. And for me, it's interesting. I've been listening to, I mentioned earlier, I did a retro video game podcast. I've been listening to archived episodes of my favorite retro video game podcasts, going way back to like 2007 and 2008 when their shows first started, only because while they are still continuing to release their weekly episodes, I'm finding I need more. So I'm not suggesting, you need to be there for your audience emotionally or psychologically, in the sense that you need to start doing content about COVID-19, or you need to start doing content about dealing with social distancing and all these things. You just need to keep doing what you're doing, because they probably don't want you, if you're a entertaining podcast, if you do comedy, if you do a music show or a video game show, they don't want you to take a 180 specifically and just stop doing what you're doing. They want you to continue to provide that escape, that sense of normalcy, right? So continue to put out the content that you feel comfortable putting out, that they're used to getting, right? Because in a lot of ways, that becomes comfort food for them. And the other thing to consider too is you're a guide, right? Everyone's going through a different journey right now. And I think that I'm a big fan of the hero's journey archetype. So if you look at the story fabric of Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, it all kind of follows the same pattern. And that's Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. And one of the archetypes there is the guide, right? So the idea of you're not the hero, your listener is the hero. And they're going through their own struggles, their own trials. And really your role is to be the guide, right? And to see them to the next stage. And you can do that in a variety of different ways. It's going to vary based on, your podcast and the content, the relationship you have with your audience. But there's an opportunity for you here to see your audience as individual heroes who are going through struggles, and then reorient yourself, really see yourself as the guide there. So a couple of tips that I've found were really effective for me, and in conversations I've had with other podcasters when podcasting through a pandemic. The one thing you have to do, I think, is just acknowledge things that are happening. So I don't think you need to have full episodes again about COVID-19, but you do have to acknowledge that the world is different and the world is changing. And I think you can do that quickly, very quickly. And then, like I said, get right into your regularly scheduled programming to deliver that comfort food. Empathize, always empathize and put yourself in the listener's shoes and understand that, things are different. And they're going through different times. And really then after you do those two things, just do what you do best, right? And just deliver the best content that you can deliver. And if that can't be an hour-long episode because you just can't do it, given your specific situation, then cut it down to 30 minutes or 25 minutes. But again, if you can consistently be there, putting out great content for your audience, you'll help lead them through this challenging time, lead them through the pandemic. And next I want to talk about, leading yourself. Leading yourself is interesting. I think that's one of the best sayings. I don't even know if you would call it a saying, but when you're on an airplane, and I think just thinking about being on an airplane right now is kind of strange to begin with. Who knows when the airline industry is going to bounce back? But they always tell you when if the oxygen masks are to fall, make sure you put your mask on first and secure that before attempting to put the mask on anyone else, right? And I love that metaphor for really thinking through, like, if you want to be the guide, if you want to help somebody, if you want to lead, you really have to take care of yourself and lead yourself first, right? So put the oxygen mask on first before you attempt to be there for your audience. And I think that one of the ways that you can do that is to find bright spots in your own life. For me, that is podcasting, right? So if podcasting is one of those things that made you happy, right? One of those things that made you feel complete, if that was an escape in your own life, for you to be able to get away from your 9-to-5 job, or just talk about something that is really interesting to you, or connect with people through an interview show, or just spin music. If that was something that made you complete, that's a bright spot that you want to make sure you preserve, right? So as your life is changing, if you are physically able and you're healthy and you can do this, right? You don't have to take care of a family member or anything like that. By continuing to podcast, you're really focusing on these bright spots, right? You're really making sure that you're taking care of yourself, and you're giving yourself room to feel that joy, right? We're all dealing with a lot of cruft. We're all social distancing. We're all isolated. When you can find that joy and really focus on it, that helps you bring that joy to other people. And you can do that through your own podcast. The other way to lead yourself is to just stay connected. I think that's, this group that Mike has and some other groups that I've had the pleasure of participating in various events with. Everyone is doing such a great job staying connected throughout this pandemic. I think when we think of social distancing at first, it was kind of a strange concept, but I've noticed a lot more people make new friends, connect with people even on a deep level through Zoom and through live streaming and through some of the technology that is available for us to do that. So I think it's really important for you to stay connected to your audience, but really stay connected with yourself and colleagues and other podcasters and other people, right, who can help each other. We can help each other move forward, help each other stay consistent, keep each other accountable. I think that's when things first started. I think the Tiger King was like the really popular show when this all started, and everyone was talking about the Tiger King and Netflix and a couple different shows that were on at the time. And I think for me, one way that I framed it back in March, and I still feel this way, at the end of this, when we come out of this, what do you want to look back on? Like, it was really challenging. It was really boring being at home. I just couldn't wait to get out. I couldn't wait for states to reopen so I can go to the beach or go to this place and go to that place. And that's all normal. Those are all normal feelings. But do you want to look back and say, like, I caught up on a lot of shows and I watched a lot of Netflix? Or do you want to look back and say, I made these new relationships. I formed these new connections. So there's an opportunity here while we're all stuck inside, to take advantage of that and to form new connections and stay connected even through the pandemic. So a couple different tips. Again, I think that I like this idea of recording and releasing shorter episodes. I've mentioned that a couple of times now. I think that it's easy on you, but it's also easy on the listener. So if listeners now have a new routine where they can't specifically, they don't have their commute, they're not traveling as much, they don't have the time to fit in all the podcast listening that they once were able to, they now have the opportunity in between meetings or doing the dishes or mowing the lawn to consume shorter episodes. So I think that if you are having a hard time or you're seeing your numbers dip a little bit, a quick tweak or experiment could be just to try shorter episodes and see if that fits into the new lives that people find themselves living. And again, as states open up and as people go back to work, you can ramp up those longer episodes again if people are feeling it, right? And if people are starting to ask for more content, you can do that. I always say experiment and have fun. And then finally, this is a great opportunity if you have the time to start a new show on the side, especially something that you're passionate or interested in. And again, they can be short episodes so that it's an easy lift on you. But if you have the time, this is a great chance, right? Where everyone's home and you have the opportunity to connect with new people, meet new people, start that new show on the side. You might be pleasantly surprised at the end of this, that if that show were to take off, you might have something that you were really passionate about that now became something bigger than you ever could have thought it would be, even if you haven't started it, right? And then finally, this is kind of like the last segment, lead with value. Always lead with value. Think about how you can help. Think about how you can serve people, even if that's with entertainment. If you have a comedy podcast, you are helping in more ways than you know. If you have a music podcast, you're helping in more ways than you know. So how can you give value? And in giving value, what kind of value should you expect in return? Podcasters, in my experience, a lot of podcasters are always thinking about monetization. How do I monetize my podcast? Is now the time to monetize my podcast? I think that you can focus on monetization now. In my opinion, my humble opinion, now probably isn't the time. But you might be pleasantly surprised if you were to start a Patreon page or provide bonus content for people. If you really provide value, that stuff might actually take off, right? But in terms of creating products and services and trying to monetize that podcast, get advertisers, it's tough. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty there. A lot of businesses don't have the advertising budgets that they once had. A lot of listeners are probably being a little tight with their cash as well, just because of the uncertainty. Unemployment is higher than it's ever been. So I would say take the focus, in my personal opinion, take the focus away from monetization and think of different ways that you can bring value. One of the ways, I was talking with Mike about this earlier, one of the ways that I think podcasters can really bring value to those around them is to bring their audio advantage to their place of employment or where they work. So most companies don't have podcasts. Most companies would love to have a podcast. And I think that I've been a marketer. I've been working on marketing teams, small and large, for a decade now. A lot of times companies don't have podcasts because they don't know how to do it. And they think that it's really hard and really difficult to do. And as podcasters, we know, right? We know that it's not really that hard, right? I mean, it's the work goes into it, and it's challenging to make it really good, to make really good podcast content, really good audio content. But podcasting mechanically is not that hard. You record it, you edit it, you put it, you upload it to a host, and you put it on an RSS feed, and that RSS feed shoots it out to a bunch of different directories. That's really hard for a lot of people to understand, but as podcasters, we get it, right? So if you have this ability already to create audio content, if you're not creating content for your job and your podcast is a hobby, bring that to work, right? Like, find your marketing department. If you're not in the marketing department, find them and say, hey, is there any opportunity for me to help you or work with you on spinning up a podcast for our company? What would that look like? And I think that now, when a lot of people are trying to really bring together their teams and bring together, basically, I'll go to the next slide, unify their remote teams, right? Like, audio is actually an interesting component to this. One of the things that I've been experimenting with recently is an internal podcast. So it is basically a private podcast, a podcast that is only for your specific teams, right, at work. And I think that working remotely for the first time, a lot of people are struggling with communication and struggling with staying connected. And podcasting is actually such an interesting way to disseminate information across your company, because people can consume it at different times throughout the day. They don't have to be on a live Zoom call all the time just to get information. And email is difficult, right? Because there's a lot left to be interpreted in email. So if you can say it and record it and put it on a feed, you have the opportunity to really unify remote teams that are struggling with communication. So there's a couple different ways you can bring podcasting to work. You can help create the external podcast. You can experiment with maybe doing an internal podcast or helping teams come together with audio. And there's a couple different case studies for this. Podbean has a few great case studies. VMware is a big software company that does this. So if you're interested in internal podcasts, you can Google and check out some of those. But the reason why I'm telling you this is because, like I mentioned, unemployment is at a kind of a record high for us. I think that there's an opportunity for podcasters if you bring this unique skill to your business, and you're able to help grow your business's audience through audio, through podcasting. You can really become indispensable. This is something that Seth Godin says a lot. He talks about it in, I think, the book Linchpin. Like, you want to be the linchpin, you want to be indispensable. When your company is making cuts, you don't, and if you don't want to be one of those cuts, you want to find ways to provide a lot of value. I live in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the Keystone State. I always think about that. The keystone is the stone that holds the arch together. How can you do that, right? And I think that's if you are the voice of the company, right? If you're the podcast host of the company, or you're able to show real results through podcasting for your business, there's a huge opportunity there. A couple of tips, if you're still employed, you can start your company's podcast. Like I said, if you already have one, you can experiment with starting the internal podcast. And then if you're unemployed, if you find yourself, unfortunately, furloughed or unemployed, if you do your own podcast editing, or if you've been podcasting for a long time, like, there are great opportunities and great groups for you to join to find new opportunities to produce podcasts for pay. I mean, people are still paying for editing services. People are still paying for podcast producers. There's an opportunity, of course, to help people start their own podcasts. So you can definitely monetize that if you find yourself in that situation, for sure. But yeah, like, now is such a great time to be sharpening this saw, I think. And it's something I've been encouraging a lot of people to do. So that's it. I think, my main point is be a leader, lead with audio. It's what we're good at. It's what we're passionate about. And I think that there's so many different ways that we can do it, not just our audience, but ourselves, our employers, the teams that we work with and work for. We can be leaders. This is it's not a comfortable time that we're living through. It's very challenging. It's been challenging for me. Uncertainty is the word, but like, we're in uncharted waters. And I think that's the best leaders after this are the ones who are going to consistently lead through the pain and lead through the discomfort. It's not easy, but I think that it's very rewarding, right? As we continue to move through this and get through this, I think it's very rewarding. If we can say and look back that we grew together, we helped people get through it. And again, you can have a comedy podcast, you can have a video game podcast, you can have a COVID-19 podcast, you can have any medium. But if you're filling a gap, filling a void for your audience, you're helping them in a certain way. And that's really important right now. If you want to get in touch with me, my email address is here, tom@tomtatejr.com. I just started this new email newsletter. Well, I started it when I gave this presentation. So I've done about 7 issues now. You can check that out at distantpals.com. And there's a corresponding podcast to that too, where I've just been talking to people about their social distancing experience. And this was just like a one-off experiment that I just wanted to do. It's been very fun. You can find me on Twitter too, @TNRT. It's 4 letters, easy to remember. Probably the easiest way to catch me. But yeah, like, I love talking about this stuff. So if anybody wants to chat, feel free to jump into the comments, of course. And but yeah, any questions that you might have. And Mike, if you have any thoughts or questions, or I'm curious how your experience has been, for sure.
No, I had a couple of questions for you. When you do an internal podcast, who do you host that with, or how do you do that? A little tips on that might be great to hear.
Yeah, definitely. So I would look to Podbean because I started to do a lot of research, and Podbean seems to be like the most equipped host for this. Mm-hmm. But the general idea is that you're providing a very specific RSS feed that's just your internal teams can access, right? And there's a couple different ways that you can really lock that down if you have to, so that certain hosts are more equipped than others. But really, you could do this with any host just by providing that RSS feed directly and not publishing it to iTunes or Spotify or any of those places, right? You would just create the content as you would, take that RSS feed, share that with your internal teams and say, hey, here's how you can take this RSS feed and plug it into a podcast listening app. You can give some instructions or directions on how to do that. I use Pocket Casts for Android, and they let you manually put an RSS feed in if you want to.
Oh, wow.
So it's more of a manual thing than pushing it out to iTunes and just hoping no one listens to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, and I was thinking that too. With your distant pals, I have been working on a podcast with a friend of mine who's in her 70s, and she's doing a podcast called One for the Ages, and it's basically she lost a couple of her friends that were her best friends, and she has no kids or any family, so they were her, like, she spent all the holidays and stuff with them. So she's doing this podcast just about how to live, and like there's resources and things for people in her same situation, because I think there's a lot of people like that. Anyway, I was just thinking about that. Be a good person for you to interview for your podcast.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, she's fantastic. Yeah. And she's so into podcasting. Like I said, well, I'll help you. And then she just dove into it. She's amazing. But anyway, I just thought that right away.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the people I spoke to for that podcast, his name's Anthony. He lives in Australia, and he really encouraged me. I haven't done this yet. I really should. But he encouraged me to, if your grandparents are still living, if anybody is still living in your family, who lived through the Great Depression, right? Or who lived through some of our most challenging times as a country, to reach out to them and just get them on a Zoom call and just record that. Even if you don't publish it, or even if you don't make that into a podcast episode, it's just, we're living through this interesting time. And for me, I'm in my mid 30s, right? So I've only lived through so many interesting times. I've 9/11. I've lived through the initial crash in 2008, right? But like this is
huge, though.
But this is like nothing like anything else. But you don't realize how many people around you and how many people in your immediate family lived through so much more, right? And we never get those stories because they don't come up. Those stories don't always come up at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I think that if you really were to frame a conversation as a podcaster would, interview, and as a podcaster would frame a story and conversation, to document those kind of things, I think feels like a good time to do that. I just, I haven't personally done it yet, but I've been thinking about it very much.
Yeah, it is interesting. There was somebody in our group too that I remember talking to that was going and recording people's family members, and which is a great thing because I have one tape of my dad who died. He was like my best friend, but he died like a long time ago now. But I had this one tape and I listened to it all the time. And then I was watching this Pixar movie with my daughter, that new one that just came out, Onward, or see that? And then he's listening to the tape of his dad that he never met. And I thought, oh my God, that's just what, I have this one tape and I'm a kid. He's trying to interview me on a cassette tape. But it's so important to get your family members. You're right. It's just cool. I know right now what's happening, but just in general, since people who know how to record, such a great idea just to get their loved ones on audio, just to have it.
Yeah, we have the skill. We might. And
you brought up a lot of great points about just kind of being leaders and stuff. Because if you do have an audience, you should be a leader. I really like that a lot.
And again, it doesn't have to be like political. It doesn't have to be in your face with like pushing your opinion on how we need to address a pandemic. Leading could just be, if you do a comedy podcast, just continuing to do your comedy podcast and just continuing to be there, and be there for your audience.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to start a new show right now because you do have a little bit of time. Some people do. It's a good idea. I'm wrestling with the podcast for this group, my own company, like we talked about earlier. And then I wrote a children's book, which I want to do a podcast too, which is a totally creative thing. And I've been working on that too, which has been fun, but it's interesting. It is the time now to get it done. So anyway, great stuff, Tom.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This has been awesome.
Yeah. No, really great. Yeah.
Hopefully, hopefully I can come back in the distant future and we can talk about other things that are less uncertain and less pandemic-y.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
I know that the title really pulls them in, I think, with the podcasting in a pandemic. It's
Yeah,
nice.
for sure.